The heat was merciless. That afternoon, Pacific sky, white like boiled bone, air humming with flies and diesel fumes. A row of Japanese women, thin as reeds, stood under a torn canvas awning, while a group of American soldiers set up cameras on tripods. The sergeant barked orders in English. A translator stumbled through in broken Japanese. Smile, show peace, kiss each other. The words landed heavier than bullets. No one moved. The women's khaki uniforms clung to sweat-damp skin, faces sunburned and blank. Behind the lens, a corporal adjusted the focus ring. The metallic click cutting through the silence. The order wasn't about cruelty, was about proof. Washington wanted photographs showing the civilized treatment of female prisoners. The brass believed the home front needed to see compassion, not conquest. In the Pacific, nearly 10,000 Japanese women had been captured across Burma. The Philippines and Borneo nurses, clerks and signal operators swept into chaos when their garrisons fell. Fewer than 2% would ever be photographed. This was one of those moments. The women didn't understand the command at first. Then one of them, trembling, realized he meant lips. A forced kiss, staged 4, Mercy's Theater. The soldier holding the camera swallowed hard. He'd fought through Iwo Jima and seen real horror. But this made his stomach twist. Still, orders were orders. The translator repeated it. The women froze, shame burning hotter than the noon sun from somewhere in the back. One prisoner whispered, "We are not animals." Her voice cracked but carried. A guard turned his head sharply. The sergeant pretended not to hear. The photographer hesitated, his finger hovering above the shutter. Then, as if to break the tension, one woman stepped forward. Her face was calm, but her eyes hollow, an act of survival. She turned to another prisoner, leaned close, and pressed her lips briefly, mechanically, to hers. The camera clicked. The soldiers didn't cheer. No one smiled. The sound of the shutter echoed like a rifle shot, in a room too quiet. In that instant, even the Americans seemed unsure what victory looked like. The sergeant muttered something under his breath and lowered the camera, sweat tracing lines down his temples. Something invisible had shifted. The moment they thought would show mercy, instead showed something. Darker mutual humiliation caught on film, and as the lens cooled in the heat, one question burned. Who had really obeyed the order? The next morning, before the sun cleared the palms, a jeep rolled into the camp, carrying 2 men in pressed uniforms, public relations officers from headquarters. Their boots hit the dirt like punctuation marks. They unfolded a typed memo, stamped Psychological Operations Division. The American sergeant, who'd taken the photographs the day before, stood at attention, his face pale under the brim of his helmet. The senior officer glanced at him, then at the women still sitting silently near the fence. "We'll need more images," he said flatly. "Washington wants human interest, something that says mercy." The sergeant's jaw clenched. He'd followed brutal orders before: advance, fire, clear the bunker, but this was different. This one gnawed at the gut. He muttered, "Sir, they're prisoners, not props." The officer barely looked up. "We're not hurting them. We're helping our narrative." Behind them, a corporal whispered, "Helping who?" In 1945, the U.S. War Department was flooding the world with 80 million propaganda leaflets. Some showed smiling Allied soldiers handing out candy. Others featured nurses tending to pots. The goal was simple: prove moral superiority. But inside this humid compound, the line between morality and performance blurred like the heat mirage rising off the sand. One of the female prisoners, a nurse named Fu, barely 21, watched the men argue. She couldn't understand the words, but she saw their eyes. One pair burned with shame, the other with bureaucracy. To her, both looked foreign. She whispered to another woman, "Why do they care how we look?" The translator, overhearing, sighed softly. "For their people, not for us." As the PR team prepared new camera angles, the sergeant's hands trembled. He remembered the phrase from his briefing: "Display the benevolence of democracy." He wondered if democracy had a taste. If it tasted like sweat and dust and fear. Then the order came down clear. Repeat yesterday's demonstration. Make it cleaner. Make it look willing. A stillness fell over the camp. Even the flies seemed to pause mid-air. The sergeant stared at the women, at Fumiko's hollow eyes. The camera's lens gleamed in the sunlight like a weapon reloaded. He raised it, but this time he hesitated. The women didn't move. No one wanted to be first. The shutter hadn't clicked yet. But the air was already cracking under pressure, and under that blinding sun, one soldier decided he couldn't follow the script again. By noon, the Pacific heat had turned brutal metal canteens too hot to touch, the air thick with salt and dust. The prisoners were lined up again, same torn uniforms, same confusion hanging between them and the guards. Sweat rolled down their necks like thin silver threads. The sergeant wiped his forehead, eyes darting between the camera and the trembling women. He hated the stillness. It felt wrong, staged, lifeless. "Let's get this done," someone muttered. Then a thud broke the silence. One of the women, Fumiko, collapsed, face first, into the sand. For a second, no one moved. The translator gasped. The camera officer cursed under his breath, slinging his gear aside. "Medic," he shouted. A young American with a Red Cross patch sprinted forward, dropping to his knees beside her. The heat had drained every drop of moisture from her body. The medic checked her pulse, pressed a canteen to her lips. She tried to resist, shaking her head weakly, but instinct won. Water trickled down her throat. The soldiers stood awkwardly, their rifles lowered, in the camps scattered across the Pacific. Reports indicate the temperature often reached nearly 38 degrees Celsius, hot enough to blister skin through clothing. Dehydration was a silent killer. In some compounds, it claimed more lives than bullets. But this wasn't just about weather. Something human had cracked through the protocol. The medic's voice was calm, easy. "Breathe." His tone wasn't pity, just procedure, but the prisoners watched, stunned. No one had touched them gently since their capture. Fumiko's hand trembled, brushing against his wrist. For a heartbeat, the world shrank to that point of contact. Two uniforms, two sides, one pulse. Later, when she regained consciousness, she couldn't meet anyone's eyes. The shame wasn't from weakness, it was from being helped. "He could have let me die," she whispered that night to another woman. "Why didn't he?" The translator overheard and shrugged quietly. "Because he's not your enemy anymore," he said. Though even he didn't sound convinced. That small, simple act, water shared in the furnace of war, did something no leaflet could. It rewired perception, at least for one moment. The women began to question the clean borders between cruelty and care. And as Fumiko looked up from the sand, seeing the same camera glinting in the distance, she realized the lens was still pointed at them, waiting for something new. That night, the camp looked different. The floodlights threw pale halos across the wire fence, and the jungle beyond hummed with insects. The women huddled together on their sleeping mats in straw, over packed dirt, voices barely above a whisper. The air smelled of rust, sweat, and boiled rice. The memory of the day hung over them like smoke. Fumiko's collapse had shaken something loose. Now every whispered sentence carried both fear and forbidden curiosity. One woman hissed, "They made us kiss, but then gave us water. What do they want?" Another answered, "To show kindness," or to make themselves feel pure. The talk spread in fragments through the barrack bits of translation. Half-understood English words, the sound of sandals brushing the floor. In the dim light, faces flickered between anger and confusion. Many of these women weren't soldiers at all. They'd been part of the Imperial Women's Auxiliary Service, clerks, nurses, and radio operators. Reports estimate that 1 in 5 Japanese prisoners in Allied hands were women. Most untrained for combat, captured while tending to the wounded. Their pride had been their last uniform. Now, even that felt stripped away. A guard passed by outside, boots crunching on gravel. The whispers froze. When the sound faded, Fumiko spoke again. "If they are monsters," she said quietly, "why did they give me water?" No one replied. For the first time, the question didn't sound rhetorical. The translator, who slept near the gate, overheard bits of their conversation. He didn't intervene. Instead, he stared at the moonlight, cutting through the barbed wire, wondering which side of it really held the prisoners. Across the camp, the sergeant sat alone with his cigarette. He could still see the medic's hands steadying that frail woman. It haunted him. The next order was already written in his mind, typed up by men who'd never smelled rot or heard a body hit dirt. Tomorrow, they wanted film moving pictures. Do it again, the memo said, this time unreal. When dawn came, a humid mist rolled in from the ocean, wrapping the camp in a pale, ghost-like fog. The women woke to the sound of trucks backing up and camera crates thudding on the ground. They knew what that meant. It was time for take two. The fog hadn't lifted when the order came. Form up. Same positions. The words snapped through the humid air like whips. The camera crew unpacked reels and metal tripods, their breath rising in faint clouds despite the heat. The sergeant's stomach churned. He could still feel yesterday's unease burning behind his ribs. He watched the women step out of the barracks' faces' unreadable eyes, hollowed by exhaustion. Somewhere in the back, Fumiko moved slower than the rest, her thin fingers clutching the edge of her tunic. This time, there were no still photos. The public relations officer wanted film. Keep them calm, he told the translator. We need cooperation. The translator hesitated. He knew the words sounded different when spoken to the broken. The sergeant adjusted the lens. Behind him, the camera word, alive. It's real, spinning like a small mechanical heart. The officer barked. Action. But no one moved. The silence stretched long enough to make even the guards uncomfortable. Then the officer snapped, make them do it again. That was the breaking point. One of the women, short nurse with cropped hair, stepped forward and shook her head. No, she said softly, barely audible, but solid as iron. The officer frowned. Translate that. The translator swallowed. She refuses. The sergeant felt something snap inside him too. He stepped forward, blocking the camera. That's enough, he said, voice low. The officer blinked. You're out of line, Sergeant. He didn't care. Sir, this isn't Merciet's theater. The air went dead quiet. Even the insects seemed to stop. In the records of Pacific operations, roughly 437 cases of insubordination were logged during 1945 alone. Most were about exhaustion or trauma, but a few, like this, were moral fractures. The officer's face turned red. Stand down. The sergeant didn't move. The camera kept rolling, the reel spinning uselessly, capturing defiance instead of obedience. The officer finally hissed, "Cut it." He stormed off toward the jeep, muttering about court-martial paperwork. The sergeant turned back to the women. No more, he said quietly. No translator needed. The meaning carried, and though no one clapped, something in the air broke open like a window cracked after a long storm. That ripple, born from one man's refusal, would travel farther than any reel. That evening, the tension didn't dissolve it, just thinned into silence. The sergeant sat at a rough wooden table near the mess tent, a single lantern swinging overhead. Around him, the other soldiers wrote letters home, their pencils scratching like tiny saws in the dark. The air smelled of tobacco and damp rope. Each man had his own story to send back, edited, softened, and censored before it ever reached American soil. He began his own letter. Ma, the war's almost over, but not how they show it on the newsreels. His handwriting wavered. He didn't describe the kiss, or the collapse, or the refusal. He wrote instead about a camp by the sea, about people we're told to hate, who look a lot like anyone else. When he finished, he folded the paper, sealed it with a thumbprint of sweat, and slid it into the pile for review. He knew parts of it would vanish. Every letter out of the Pacific passed through censorship stations, at 1,000 censors in total. Their job to erase doubt and maintain morale. A few tents away, another soldier wrote his version. He mentioned the photo session, calling it a goodwill shoot. His words were cleaner, easier to approve. The censor's pencil would barely have to move. The truth, meanwhile, lay tangled in the dust between their boots. Inside the barracks, the women also spoke of letters but theirs had no paper, no destination. They whispered to the air, imagining their families hearing them somehow. Fumiko murmured to the night, "If my mother saw me, she wouldn't know me." The translator, sitting by the gate, understood, but didn't translate. He was too tired to turn pain into sentences again by midnight. The censors collected the envelopes, stamping each one with invisible approval or erasure. Somewhere in that stack lay the sergeant's letter, the one that didn't fit the narrative. Days later, on a ship bound for San Francisco, a postal clerk missed a page during inspection. It slipped through the system like a single thread pulled from a uniform, and that one page creased, smudged, and nearly lost would soon land on the desk of a journalist who'd been looking for something different from victory speeches. He'd find it there, buried in the quiet handwriting of a tired man. 3 weeks later, a mail sack burst open in a coastal post office in California. Among the damp envelopes and wrinkled stationery was a letter without its censor's red mark. A journalist named Harold Winters picked it up by accident. He'd come to collect local soldiers' stories for a small-town paper. He unfolded the page, read the words, and stopped breathing for a moment. The handwriting was uneven but raw. They made them kiss each other for the camera. We were told it was mercy. He read it twice. It wasn't a confession, not quite. Was dissonance caught on paper, the kind that gnawed at conscience. Harold was a veteran himself, wounded in New Guinea, now typing stories instead of firing rifles. He knew what propaganda looked like. He also knew this letter could burn through the lies if handled right. That night, in his dim newsroom, he tapped the story out on a black Remington typewriter. The headline read, "G is protect Japanese nurses. Kindness amid chaos." He couldn't print the darker truth knot without clearance, but he let the tone do the talking. Between the lines, the story trembled. The newspaper, the Oregon Daily, printed 15,000 copies that morning. Across the Pacific, about 15 million Americans would read similar homefront comfort stories every day in 19. But this one, this tiny coastal piece, was different. It felt too human, too complicated. It didn't sound like victory. Within days, other outlets picked it up. Radio hosts quoted it, trimming out the uncomfortable details, but leaving just enough to suggest grace. "American compassion in the islands," one announcer said, voice smooth as silk. In the camp, of course, no one knew yet. The women still lined up for roll call, still whispered through the night. But on the other side of the ocean, strangers now imagined them smiling. Harold clipped his own article from the front page and pinned it to his wall. He stared at it a long time, knowing it wasn't the full truth. But it was a start. And as the presses cooled and the ink dried, the story began to drift across waters it was never meant to cross. In Tokyo, weeks later, an editor would read that same headline and feel his blood boil. In late summer, Tokyo's air was still thick with the smell of ash and uncertainty. Newspapers arrived from the ports, folded and worn, carrying foreign headlines. One caught the eye of an editor at Yomiuri Shinban. "G is protect Japanese nurses." The article claimed American soldiers were treating captured Japanese women with kindness and respect. The editor read it twice, his cigarette trembling between his fingers. Then he slammed the paper onto his desk. "Flies," he muttered. "Pure humiliation, dressed as mercy." Within hours, the story was circulating in the capital quietly at first. Then, through whispers in train stations, ration lines, and military offices, families of missing nurses began asking questions. Is this true? Are they alive? Others spat in disgust. They forced them to pose. How can they call that kindness? Japan's Home Ministry moved fast. The government's press bureau monitored more than 700 publications, and any story that could soften the image of surrender was buried. Censors were dispatched to confiscate foreign papers and silence local chatter. But it was too late. The rumor had already escaped into kitchens and alleyways, where people clung to it like a half-truth worth believing. In one Tokyo boarding house, an older woman read the headline aloud to her neighbors. Her daughter had vanished in the Philippines months before. Maybe she's safe, she whispered, voice quivering. Another woman hissed back. Safe. You think the Americans would show mercy for free? The room went silent. Even in defeat, pride was the last thing no bomb could burn. Across the Pacific, the sergeant who wrote the letter didn't know any of this. He was back on cleanup duty, guarding the same prisoners who had unknowingly become propaganda. Fumiko, meanwhile, heard fragments from a guard who'd seen the newspaper clipping. Tokyo knows, he said softly, in English, unsure if she understood. She didn't need translation. She saw it, in his eyes, a strange mix of pity and guilt. That night, when she told the others, no one believed her. They think we kissed because we wanted to, she said. The words landed heavy, echoing through the dark like stones dropped into water. Outside, the same camera crew returned, setting up lights for another round of filming. This time, something different, something quieter. Tomorrow, they would share food. Morning broke slow, wrapped in a heavy stillness that even the cicadas seemed to respect. The camera crew was gone, but the Americans stayed. A soldier dragged a crate toward the wire fence, its wood-stamped U.S. Army rations. He pried it open with a bayonet and pulled out tins of peaches and loaves of white bread, soft, pale, and almost glowing in the tropical light. Share it, the sergeant said. No orders from above this time. No photographers, just instinct. The Japanese women hesitated. Food had always come as command, not invitation. For months, they had eaten rice so thin it dissolved in water, their stomachs shrinking to the size of clenched fists. Now, the sweet metallic scent of canned fruit hit them like a memory from another world. The sergeant split one tin and slid it under the wire. The liquid shimmered golden in the sun. Fumiko stared at it, then at him. For a long moment, no one moved. Finally, she picked up a slice sticky, dripping, and bit down. The sugar burned her throat. Tears welled up uninvited. Sweet, she whispered, half in disbelief. She hadn't tasted sugar in years. On the other side of the fence, the soldiers watched quietly. They didn't speak, didn't joke, didn't take photos. Each bite felt heavier than gunfire. Reports estimate an American GI consumed nearly 4,000 calories a day. A prisoner here survived on less than 1,200. That difference measured in bread, not bullets, was its own kind of weapon. The meal stretched into silence. A second Ken rolled under the wire, then another. Slowly, the women began to eat together, heads bowed, not in gratitude. Not yet, but in something wordless. Fumiko looked up once, catching the sergeant's eyes through the wire. Neither smiled. Neither looked away. For the first time, they didn't see enemy lines, just a fence built from the same fear. When the rations ran out, no one spoke. The women retreated to their barracks. The soldiers turned toward the sea. The sun dipped low, spilling orange light over the camp. That night, in the dim glow of a lantern, a cigarette box appeared at the fence. Inside it, a folded scrap of paper. The words were shaky, written in bad Japanese. I'm sorry. The paper was small, folded twice, its edges smudged with dirt and tobacco. Fumiko opened it under the weak glow of a lantern. The handwriting was clumsy, the grammar broken, but the meaning was clear enough. I'm sorry. No rank, no name, just a soldier's apology sneaked through a cigarette box. The women stared at the note like it might explode. Apologies didn't exist here. Orders did. Hunger did, but not this. Fumiko's fingers trembled as she reread the words, tracing each uneven line. Then, without speaking, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a scrap of paper torn from a supply log. She folded it carefully, corner to corner, until a small crane took shape in her hands. The next morning, when the guards weren't watching, she placed it where the box had been. The wind caught the wings slightly, making the paper bird nod, as if it already understood the exchange. Later that day, a soldier found it. He didn't tell anyone. He just kept it, tucked in his breast pocket behind a dog tag. The quiet trade continued. For nights, apology notes slipped through. Tiny cranes returned. Neither side knew exactly why they kept doing it. Maybe because guilt needed shape. Maybe because forgiveness needed proof. Reports later described that over 60,000 paper cranes would become peace symbols across post-war Japan. But here, in this forgotten camp, it started as something smaller, a secret between a handful of people trying to stay human. The sergeant knew about the notes. He pretended not to. When asked for reports, he wrote only one line: no unrest, morale stable. But every night, he watched that fence and wondered if peace could really be built from scraps and smoke. One evening, a single crane appeared inside his tent, perfectly folded, untouched by dirt. He stared at it for a long time, the lantern light flickering over its wings. For the first time since the orders, he didn't feel like the man giving them outside. Rain began to fall, soft, persistent, washing the dust off the barbed wire. Tomorrow, the war would end. Rumors had already started. Surrender talks, ceasefire, ships turning homeward. And when it came, those same women would face the camera one last time, this time by choice. August 1945. The Pacific sky was strangely quiet. No bombers, no sirens, just the low hum of wind moving through the palm trees. The radio crackled in the command tent. Japan has surrendered. The words hung heavy, half unbelievable. Outside, the soldiers froze mid. Some cheered, some just stared at the ground. In the women's barracks, silence first, then a trembling sigh, like air escaping from a wound that had waited too long to heal. They were free. Technically, the gates didn't open that instant. Paperwork had to be signed, ships arranged, orders clarified. But the guards' posture changed. Rifles dipped, voices softened. For the first time, the prisoners were addressed as ladies, not enemy personnel. The sergeant approached Fumiko and the others, holding a box of belongings, gathered months before. Letters, a photograph of a family standing by cherry blossoms. He handed it back without a word. She bowed slightly, the gesture slow, deliberate. Final. Report logs say only 312 Japanese female POWs ever returned from Pacific camps alive. Most disappeared into the noise of repatriation, their names reduced to lists. But for those few days before departure, a strange calm took hold. The Americans offered clean uniforms for the journey. The same cameras that once demanded shame were brought out again this time. To document release, the women stood before the lens, sunlight bouncing off the wire that had caged them. Smile, the photographer said softly. No one needed translation. They did smile, but not for him. For themselves. For the fact that they were standing, breathing, unbroken. Fumiko turned slightly, seeing the sergeant across the yard. He raised a hand, half wave, half farewell. She mirrored the gesture. No words, just mutual acknowledgement of something neither had language for. When the ships finally sailed, the paper crane the sergeant kept in his pocket went with him. He would later write in a private journal, "She taught me that mercy isn't weakness. It's the last thing that survives war." Back in Japan, years later, Fumiko told her daughter, "They made us smile once, because they ordered it. The second time, because we chose to. Sometimes survival isn't defiance, it's quiet reclamation."